Hey Hope City, it's Phil here, back with more from Joshua as we continue our conversation on returning to mission. Today we're going to talk about Caleb, who the scriptures say followed the Lord our God wholeheartedly. In fact, the passage today drives home the point by saying this no fewer than 3 times. So we're going to be talking about Caleb because so often in the story of the people of Israel conquering the promised land, Caleb is forgotten. He's an afterthought in many ways. And I think sometimes this is because of our inclination as human beings to only focus on leaders. Our culture glorifies and worships those who lead. Whether we're talking about LeBron or Joseph Biden or Bonnie Henry, we tend to focus only on those who lead. In fact, the book that we've been studying this entire fall is called the Book of Joshua. And he is the leader of God's people after Moses died. But in some ways, he gets all this attention. And then here, in the middle of the book of Joshua, right here in chapter 14, we get this amazing encounter between Joshua and Caleb. And we see that in this chapter, what it's trying to get across to us is that when it comes to accomplishing God's mission, if everyone were a leader, nothing would be accomplished. In fact, when everyone chooses to lead rather than follow God, disaster and chaos ensues. And I think Joshua and Caleb would actually tell you that when everyone decides to lead and call the shots, opportunities are actually lost. And it's here in chapter 14 that we see that for God's mission to be accomplished, what is actually required is that we let Him lead. We let God lead. And then we respond to His leadership by following Him wholeheartedly. You see, mission is following the Lord our God wholeheartedly. If we're serious about being part of God's mission to make all things new, we need to learn to follow Him wholeheartedly. So what I'd like to do today is have a look at Caleb, have a look at his life, and see if we can draw some pointers and some encouragement for us so that we can learn to follow the Lord our God wholeheartedly as well. And maybe if we learn how to follow Him, we'll actually be effective in mission, in accomplishing His purposes. So the question I want to ask as we look at this text today is this: what does it look like to follow the Lord our God wholeheartedly? What does it look like to follow the Lord wholeheartedly? There's 3 things that I want to draw out for us today. And the first is this, that those who follow the Lord wholeheartedly, they live according to their convictions rather than their fear. Let me say that again. Those who follow the Lord wholeheartedly live according to their convictions rather than their fear. Let's have a look at Caleb's journey. At this point in our narrative in chapter 14, Caleb is one of only 2 men who escaped Egypt in the Exodus, who crossed the Red Sea, who wandered the desert for 40 years, and is now entering into the promised land. But not only that, he and Joshua, they were actually part of this original team of spies that Moses sent out shortly after God had rescued them from Egypt. Moses sent them out to spy out the land before they followed God's command to enter in and to receive it. In the passage that we read today, Caleb tells us that he was 40 years old when they were sent out to explore the land. And this is what he says. He says, "I brought back a report according to my convictions, but my fellow Israelites who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt in fear." Who is Caleb? Caleb is a man who lived according to his convictions rather than his fears. You see, the spies, Caleb and Joshua included, they all saw the same things. They all saw the bountiful produce. They actually brought back a whole vine of grapes back to Moses and back to the community to show them how amazing this land is. but they also saw how heavily fortified the cities were. They also saw the inhabitants, who they described as being like giants. You see, while the other 10 spies couldn't shake the image of their insurmountable odds and their overwhelming challenges, Caleb and Joshua chose to trust and chose to put their trust in God's promise to actually deliver the land into their hands more than what, I guess, wisdom or military analysis would suggest. They chose to be led by their convictions that God would fight for them no matter how formidable their enemies were. They chose to trust in God. They chose to be led by their convictions rather than to be led by their fear. You see, Caleb followed the Lord, his God, wholeheartedly. He lived according to his convictions rather than his fears. Those who follow the Lord wholeheartedly will live according to their conviction rather than their fears. And so this makes us wrestle with the reality that you and I, we face challenges. We have fears. And so I think it's appropriate for us to just name them. And so maybe in our microchurches, we can talk about this. What are some challenges and fears that you're facing right now that you can give to God? What are some challenges and fears that you're facing right now that you can give to God? You see, we can choose to either be dominated by our fears, overwhelmed by our challenges, or we can choose to give them to God. We can choose to let Him lead us, and we can trust Him to take care of us. Those who follow the Lord wholeheartedly, they choose to live according to their convictions rather than their fear. Second thing, those who follow the Lord wholeheartedly may have to wait a lifetime for God to fulfill His promise. Basically, those who follow the Lord wholeheartedly are people who are familiar with what it means to practice the art of patience. You see, while Caleb and Joshua lived according to their convictions, the rest of the people, led on by the other spies, they rebelled against the Lord. They refused to receive the land that He had promised them. They didn't believe that He would fight for them and protect them. They saw the walls, they saw the cities, they saw how fortified they were, they saw how strong the people were, and they only saw that, and they thought in their minds, there's no way we can defeat them. And I'm not saying Joshua and Caleb thought more of themselves. It's simply that they thought more of God. That's where the conviction lies. And the people refused to trust that God would do what He promised. And so God then turns to Caleb, and He makes this promise with Caleb instead. He says this, "The land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance, and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly." Caleb followed the Lord wholeheartedly, and he received God's promise of a very specific inheritance. And you see, in this passage here in chapter 14, this is what he's asking Joshua for. You see, every other tribe, after they had conquered the entire land, after they took out 31 kings, they received their inheritance by lot, by chance. But Caleb's inheritance was different. His was promised to him because of his obedience. You see, Caleb followed the Lord wholeheartedly, and he waited 45 years for God's promise to be fulfilled. You know, I love verses 10 and 11, because this is what Caleb says. He says, "Now then, just as the Lord had promised, He has kept me alive for 45 years since the time He said this to Moses, while Israel moved around in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I am just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then." I don't know if that inspires you, but that inspires me. And I don't know who comes to mind for you when you hear these verses, but the guy that comes to mind for me is this elderly man that I always seem to come across whenever I'm running the loop around Burnaby Lake. And the Burnaby Lake loop is around 10 kilometers, and somewhere around kilometer 7 or 8, I start to fade. Okay? Like all the enthusiasm and all the energy that I had at the start of my run, I have lost. Okay? And I am very thirsty, I am very hungry, and I'm starting to move slow. Okay? And somewhere along, like, kilometer 7 or 8, I always come across this elderly man. And he's just gliding. It's effortless for him. And I mean, he is strong. He's probably in his 70s, but he is faster. He is stronger than me. And he's the guy I want to be in my 70s. If I happen to be 70 years old and I'm still running around Burnaby Lake, that, mission accomplished for me. I want to be able to finish strong in life like this man I see at Burnaby Lake. That's who comes to mind for me when I read this passage. I don't know who comes to mind for you. Maybe you have some folks that you really admire, who are more experienced in life, who know the battles and are still going strong. That's Caleb. Caleb is 85 years old. And he says that at 85, God has kept him not just alive, but has kept him strong and ready for battle as that day when he was 40. See, I don't know if Caleb is an anomaly, like it's his genetics, or if he kept himself really fit, right? Like he had this regimen going for 45 years, or if God did something supernatural so that he was so ready. I actually think it was a combination of both. That God kept him alive, kept him strong, because God knew that Caleb was going to accomplish this sometime in his life. And yet, on the other hand, I think that Caleb's faith in God's promise actually kept him focused on God's mission that God sent him on all these years before. That he has been preparing for this moment since God made him this promise. He's kept himself ready as well for 45 years. And I wonder if you and I can possibly imagine what it's like to wait 45 years for God to fulfill his promise to you or I. 45 years after probably the most disappointing day of your life. What is the longest that you have ever had to wait for something? And at what point when you're waiting will you give up? Will you move on? I don't think any of us have waited 4 years, 10 years, 20 years, never mind 45 years. Caleb followed the Lord wholeheartedly. He followed him for 45 years wholeheartedly since God's promise was fulfilled. You see, those who follow the Lord wholeheartedly, they may have to wait a lifetime for God to fulfill his promise. And so the question that we can wrestle with in our microchurches is this: what are you waiting for right now? What are you and how are you spending your time as you wait? What are you waiting for right now? And like Caleb, how are you spending time as you wait? Are you getting yourself ready? Another question is this: when it comes to mission and when it comes to the people that we're praying for, our friends and our family and our neighbors, how long are we willing to wait? Are we willing to keep praying as we wait? Let me move on. The third thing that I want to talk about is that those who follow the Lord wholeheartedly, they take on challenges that God has called them to because they know that the Lord will help them. Let me say that again. Those who follow the Lord wholeheartedly take on challenges that God has called them to because they know that the Lord will help them. You see, Caleb's request for this specific plot of land, he's not asking for the best of the land. He's not asking for the most fertile or something with access to the sea where he can maybe build a resort or there's a beach where he can relax. Or he's not asking for land that's filled with easy pickings, the weakest enemies, so that him and his people don't have to expend themselves to drive them out. His request actually has to do with unfinished business. Let's listen to him in verse 12. This is what he says to Joshua. He says this, "Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourselves heard then that the Anakites were there, that their cities were large and fortified. But the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said." You see, he asked for the hill country. This is the hardest terrain to invade and attack. You got to fight going uphill. He asked to fight the Anakites. The Anakites were known as the descendants of the giants, the toughest people to fight. And the city of Hebron used to be named after the greatest of the Anakites. So no matter how strong or how fit Caleb is at 85, he is fighting, he is punching up above his weight here. And then he asks for the cities that are large and that are fortified. That's what he wants to come up against. He's asking for the most heavily protected cities with the largest armies. And he's asking this because of two things. Because this territory, that's where his feet were when he was a spy 45 years ago. That's the dust that his feet touched. That's the land that was promised to him, because this was the land that scared the people of Israel. This is what the Lord promised him, that the land and the city and the enemies that made his fellow spies melt in fear would actually be his inheritance, would be his legacy. Because they should have had it 45 years ago. And he wants to finish the mission that was given by God all these years ago. He has unfinished business. Secondly, he is asking for the hardest territory to conquer. Land that is filled with the most formidable opponents who occupy the most heavily fortified cities, because he believes with all of his heart that he's not able to do this on his own, but that if God helps him, if God does what he says, he'll be able to drive them out. You see, Caleb followed the Lord wholeheartedly. He completely depended on the Lord to help him out no matter what he faced. Wholehearted mission is completely dependent upon God's help. Those who follow the Lord wholeheartedly will take on challenges that God has called them to because they know that the Lord will help them. And so the question I would invite you to wrestle with in your microchurches is this: what has God called you to do that you are unable to do, unable to accomplish unless he helps you? What has God called you to do that you are unable to do unless he helps you? Those are the things that we're called to be a part of. Those are the things that we're called to do. All right, I hope you guys have a great time in your microchurches this week. I will see you next week. Take care.